The rain pounded against the windshield of the patrol car, its rhythmic tapping the only sound breaking the uneasy silence. Detective Olivia Carter sat in the driver's seat, her jaw clenched, her fingers wrapped tightly around the steering wheel. Shadow, her German Shepherd K9 partner, sat in the passenger seat, his ears perked, eyes scanning the darkness. The radio crackled, static hissing before a voice came through. Unit 14, possible armed suspects spotted at the abandoned steel mill on Roosevelt Avenue. Approach with caution. Backup en route. Olivia's pulse quickened. The steel mill had been closed for years, now nothing more than a decaying skeleton of rusted beams and shattered glass. But tonight, it was alive again. A trap, her instincts screamed, but she had no choice. Backup was coming, but she was closest. She reached over, running her fingers through Shadow's thick coat. Just us for now, buddy. Stay sharp. The dog let out a low, approving huff, muscles taut, eyes locked on the approaching darkness. The steel mill loomed ahead, its structure swallowed in shadows. Olivia pulled up just outside the entrance, cutting the engine. The rain muffled every other sound, but beneath it, she swore she heard something, shuffling footsteps. Gun in hand, she pushed open the door and stepped into the cold night. Shadow moved beside her, his paws silent against the wet pavement. The only source of light came from a flickering street lamp, casting long, eerie shadows across the cracked concrete. A sharp metallic clang echoed from inside. Olivia froze, raising a fist to halt Shadow. Then, gunfire. A searing pain tore through her side. She staggered, her vision swimming. Her hand instinctively clutched her abdomen, and when she pulled it away, it was slick with blood. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed onto the rain-soaked ground. Shadow didn't move. He stood his ground, muscles rigid, his teeth bared in a deep, guttural growl. From the shadows, 3 figures emerged. One held a pistol, the other 2 whispered among themselves, their voices sharp. Calculating. Just a dog, one muttered. Shadow's growl deepened. His golden eyes locked onto them, reading every move, every hesitation. He wasn't just a dog, he was a warrior. Olivia struggled to stay conscious. Her vision blurred, the world tilting. Shadow. Stay, she rasped. But Shadow had already made his choice. As the men stepped forward, the storm roared overhead, thunder masking the chaos about to unfold. Shadow lunged. The night exploded into chaos. Shadow launched forward like a missile, his powerful frame colliding with the nearest attacker, sending him sprawling onto the wet pavement. The man screamed as Shadow's teeth sank into his arm, the sickening crunch of bone breaking through the rain. Shit! Get him off! The second man yelled, raising his gun. Still on the ground, Olivia fought to steady her vision. Every breath burned, her fingers trembling as she reached for her sidearm. She could feel the blood soaking through her shirt, warm against the cold rain. But she had no time for pain. Shadow held tight, his growls mixing with the man's agonized shrieks. The second attacker aimed. Olivia fired first. The gunshot cracked through the air. The man's weapon flew from his grasp as he staggered backward, clutching his shoulder. Son of a... he hissed. The third man, the one Olivia had barely noticed before, moved fast. Too fast. He ripped a knife from his belt and lunged at Shadow. No. Olivia roared. Shadow twisted at the last second, his instincts razor-sharp. The blade missed his neck by an inch, slicing through the fur on his shoulder instead. He yelped, but pain didn't stop him, it only fueled him. With a fierce snarl, Shadow turned on the knife-wielding man, leaping up and snapping his jaws around his wrist. The knife clattered to the ground. The man screamed. Flashing red and blue lights suddenly illuminated the rain-soaked lot. Sirens howled through the night, the distant screech of tires cutting through the storm. The remaining 2 men exchanged a frantic glance. Forget it, let's go. One shouted. They bolted toward the dark alley behind the steel mill. Shadow lunged to pursue, but Olivia, still on the ground, whistled sharply. Shadow, here. Panting, the dog hesitated, torn between instinct and command. Finally, he obeyed, returning to Olivia's side, his coat drenched, his eyes wild with adrenaline. The first man lay groaning in agony on the ground, his arm twisted at an unnatural angle. The second clutched his bleeding shoulder, cursing under his breath. Olivia pressed her hand against her wound, forcing herself upright just as two squad cars skidded to a stop nearby. Doors flew open, and officers flooded out, weapons raised. Detective Carter. Deputy Eric Lawson was the first to reach her, his face twisted in concern as he dropped to one knee. Jesus, you're hit. I'm fine, Olivia gasped, barely convincing even herself. She gestured weakly toward the men. Secure them. Two more got away. Lawson nodded to the others, who moved in swiftly, forcing the suspects onto their knees, hands behind their heads. A figure stepped through the rain, Captain Rachel Monroe, her sharp eyes scanning the scene, her expression unreadable. What the hell happened? Monroe demanded. Olivia exhaled, her vision dimming at the edges. She wobbled slightly, and Shadow nudged against her, his warmth grounding her. Ambush, she managed. And it's not over. Her knees buckled. Everything blurred, then, darkness. Olivia woke to the rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor. The sterile scent of antiseptic filled her nose, mingling with the lingering taste of blood on her lips. Her vision adjusted to the dim hospital room, fluorescent lights buzzing softly above, a heavy weight pressed against her side. She turned her head, Shadow lay curled up on the hospital bed beside her, his body pressed close, his ears twitching at her movement. She exhaled. You stayed. The soft scrape of a chair moving caught her attention. Deputy Eric Lawson sat nearby, arms crossed, dark circles under his eyes. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. You gave us a hell of a scare, he muttered. How long? Olivia's voice was hoarse. 2 days. You lost a lot of blood. She shifted, wincing as pain flared through her side. The stitches pulled, but the wound was clean. Alive. Functional. That's all that mattered. Monroe entered the room, her expression unreadable as always. Glad to see you awake, Carter. You almost didn't make it. Olivia forced herself upright, Shadow immediately adjusting to her movement. The 2 men that got away, did we get them? Lawson and Monroe exchanged a glance. Not yet, Monroe admitted. But we found something else. Olivia frowned. What do you mean? Lawson pulled out a manila folder and tossed it onto the bed. We searched the steel mill after you went down. Found a hidden weapons cache, automatic rifles. C4, burner phones. This wasn't just some small-time gang operation. These guys were planning something big. Olivia's blood ran cold. She reached for the file, flipping it open. Surveillance photos. Weapons manifests. A list of locations. Then, a name. Marcus Vance. Her fingers tightened around the paper. Vance is behind this. Monroe nodded. Looks that way. And if this list is accurate, they were planning a coordinated attack, multiple sites across the city. But we don't know when. Olivia clenched her jaw. Marcus Vance wasn't just a criminal. He was a strategist, a mastermind who had evaded capture for years, leaving nothing but destruction in his wake. If he was planning an attack. It wasn't small scale. We have to move fast, she said. We need to, Monroe cut her off. You need to rest. Olivia opened her mouth to argue, but Monroe's glare was unwavering. You're no good to us half-dead, Carter. Take the night. Heal. Tomorrow, we hunt. Monroe turned on her heel and walked out, leaving Lawson behind. He sighed, rubbing his face. I know you want to go after them, Liv. But she's right. You almost died out there. Let us handle this. Olivia shook her head. You don't get it, Eric. I have to be there. Shadow and we already have their scent. We're the best chance you've got. Lawson hesitated. Then, reluctantly, he nodded. Shadow lifted his head. His golden eyes locked onto Olivia's. He knew what was coming. He was ready, so was she. Tomorrow, they would finish this. The city was still slick from the previous night's rain, the streets glistening under the morning sun. Olivia stepped out of the precinct, Shadow at her side, his ears perked, nose twitching at the crisp air. Every muscle in her body ached, the painkillers barely numbing the deep wound in her side, but she didn't have time to rest. Marcus Vance was still out there, and every minute wasted brought him closer to executing whatever attack he had planned. Lawson met her outside, holding a folder. "We got something. A lead." She took the file, flipping it open. Inside was a grainy surveillance image from a dockyard security camera. Two men, barely visible in the fog, loading crates into the back of a truck. "Recognize them?" Lawson asked. Olivia nodded grimly. "The two that got away." She studied the timestamp. 4:37 a.m. hours after the steel mill ambush. They hadn't disappeared. They were still moving, still planning. Monroe joined them, her expression unreadable as always. "We tracked that truck. It was spotted entering an old shipping yard by the river. No known businesses operate out of there anymore. Whatever they're doing, it's off the grid." Olivia shut the folder. "Then that's where we go." Monroe hesitated. "Carter, you just got out of the hospital." "I'm fine." Monroe sighed. "That's bullshit, but I know I can't stop you. Just don't get yourself killed." Olivia turned to Shadow, running her fingers through his fur. "You ready, boy?" Shadow let out a low huff, his tail flicking with anticipation. They moved out. The shipping yard was eerily silent, abandoned cranes standing like rusted skeletons against the gray sky. The smell of salt and engine oil filled the air, mingling with the faint stench of rotting wood. Olivia gripped her sidearm, pressing her back against a container as Lawson covered her from behind. Shadow was already working, his nose low, sniffing the air for any sign of movement. Then, he froze. His entire body stiffened. His ears pinned forward. Olivia barely had time to react before the first shot rang out. She dove behind cover, gripping her pistol as bullets sparked against the metal container. Lawson cursed. "They knew we were coming." Olivia gritted her teeth. "Then let's make sure they regret it." Shadow let out a sharp bark, muscles coiled. Olivia met his eyes. "Go." The dog bolted forward, weaving through the maze of shipping containers with terrifying speed. The gunfire didn't faze him, he was focused, locked on his target. Olivia moved with him, keeping low, her heart hammering. A figure appeared from behind a crate, rifle raised. Shadow was faster. He lunged, his jaws locking onto the man's arm. The attacker screamed, his weapon clattering to the ground as Shadow dragged him down. Olivia surged forward, delivering a swift kick to the man's ribs before slamming her knee into his chest. The second attacker turned the corner, already aiming. Lawson fired first. The man crumpled. Silence fell over the yard, broken only by the howling wind. Shadow remained on top of the first man, growling low. The suspect whimpered, his face twisted in pain. Olivia crouched beside him, pressing her gun to his temple. "Where's Vance?" The man spat blood onto the pavement. "Go to hell." She pressed harder. "You first." The suspect hesitated, his breathing ragged. "Warehouse. Other side of the yard." "He's waiting." Olivia exchanged a look with Lawson. It was a trap, but they were walking into it anyway. The air inside the warehouse was thick with the scent of oil and rust, the dim overhead lights flickering with an eerie hum. Olivia stepped cautiously through the entrance, her gun raised, Shadow moving silently beside her, his golden eyes scanning every shadow. Lawson flanked her, his expression tense, finger hovering over the trigger of his pistol. They knew this was a trap. But there was no turning back now. The suspect's words echoed in Olivia's mind. His waiting. Marcus Vance didn't run. He didn't hide. He planned. A sharp clang echoed from deeper inside the warehouse, followed by a low chuckle. Then, his voice, "I have to say, Detective Carter, you're a lot more persistent than I gave you credit for." The sound came from everywhere at once, bouncing off the metal walls, making it impossible to pinpoint his location. Olivia's grip tightened on her weapon. "Where are you, Vance?" A metallic scrape, the sound of a boot shifting against concrete. Then, the lights cut out. The warehouse was plunged into complete darkness. Shadow let out a warning growl, his body coiled, ready to strike. Then, movement, swift and precise. The first attacker came from the left, his blade glinting in the faint emergency glow of a distant exit sign. Olivia barely had time to react before he lunged. She twisted, dodging the strike by inches. The knife sliced through the fabric of her jacket, the cold steel grazing her ribs. Pain flared, but she didn't falter. She drove her elbow into the man's face. Hearing the crunch of bone, he staggered back just as Shadow struck. The dog leaped, his powerful jaws clamping down on the man's forearm. A scream tore through the darkness as the attacker crumpled to the ground, Shadow shaking him violently. Gunfire erupted from the other side of the warehouse. Lawson fired into the dark, ducking behind a stack of crates. "This is bad," he growled. "We're sitting ducks in here." Olivia's mind raced. They had to change the game. She reached into her vest, grabbing a small tactical flashlight, and flicked it on. The beam sliced through the shadows, revealing two more figures advancing toward them. She fired. One went down instantly, his body hitting the ground with a dull thud. The other hesitated just long enough for Lawson to land a shot to his knee. The man collapsed, howling in pain. Then, silence. The only sound was the slow, deliberate clap of hands from above. Olivia's flashlight followed the sound. Marcus Vance stood on a steel catwalk, smirking. "Well done, detective," he drawled. "You actually made it this far." Olivia didn't hesitate. She raised her gun and fired, but Vance was already moving. He ducked behind a steel pillar, vanishing into the shadows. Then, another voice, cold, calculated. "You should have stayed in the hospital, Carter." A shape dropped down from the catwalk, a new threat. Olivia barely had time to register who it was before James Reaper Holloway struck. His fist connected with her jaw, sending her staggering back. She hit the concrete hard, her vision flashing white. Shadow barked furiously, launching toward the man, but Reaper was fast. With inhuman reflexes, he pivoted, slamming a boot into Shadow's ribs, sending the dog skidding across the floor. Shadow yelped. Olivia's blood boiled. She pushed to her feet, ignoring the pain, her rage drowning out everything else. "You shouldn't have done that," she spat. Reaper just smirked. "Then come stop me." And the real fight began. The air between them crackled with tension. Olivia squared her stance, her fists clenched, pain forgotten. Reaper was built like a weapon, broad shoulders, military precision in every movement. He was a killer, and he enjoyed it. Shadow recovered quickly, scrambling to his feet, his growl low and menacing. Blood dripped from his muzzle, his golden eyes locked onto the man who had dared to strike him. "Stay," Olivia ordered, voice sharp. Shadow hesitated. She met his gaze. "I've got this," Reaper smirked. "Big mistake." He moved first, fast, brutal. Olivia barely ducked in time. His fist grazed her temple, the force behind it enough to shatter bone if it had connected fully. She countered with a sharp jab to his ribs, then another to his jaw. He didn't flinch. He grabbed her wrist, twisting it viciously. Pain flared up her arm, but she didn't cry out. Instead, she drove her knee into his stomach. He let go with a grunt, stumbling back. But he was smiling. "You've got fight," he admitted, rolling his shoulder. "I like that." She lunged. The next exchange was brutal, blow for blow, neither giving an inch, but Olivia was tired. Her wound throbbed, her vision blurred at the edges. She was slowing down, and Reaper saw it. He caught her next strike, twisting her arm behind her back and slamming her into the nearest metal crate. Stars exploded in her vision. She gasped, struggling, but his grip was like iron. "You're good, Carter," he murmured near her ear. "But not good enough." The cold press of a blade touched her throat. Shadow snapped. With a feral snarl, the dog launched, jaws locking around Reaper's forearm. The knife clattered to the ground as Reaper roared in pain. Olivia tore free, whirling just in time to see Shadow take him down completely. Reaper hit the ground hard, Shadow's teeth at his throat, snarling. He didn't move. Didn't even breathe. Smart choice. Olivia wiped blood from her mouth, chest heaving. Then, a gunshot. She whirled. Marcus Vance stood at the far end of the warehouse. Gun smoking, a sneer on his face. Lawson collapsed. Eric. Olivia's scream ripped through the air. Vance turned, running. Olivia didn't think. She fired. The shot hit his leg. He stumbled, crashing into a stack of crates. Shadow bolted after him, closing the distance within seconds. By the time Olivia reached them, Vance was pinned, face down, Shadow's jaws wrapped around his wrist, gun lying useless on the floor. She aimed her weapon at his head. He laughed, a wet, bitter sound. "Go ahead," he taunted. "Do it." Her finger hovered over the trigger. Shadow growled, tightening his grip slightly. But Olivia just exhaled. "No," she said. "You're going to rot in a cell." Sirens wailed outside as backup arrived. The aftermath was a blur. Vance and Reaper were dragged away in cuffs. The shipping yard was swarmed with officers. Lawson, bleeding but alive, was loaded into an ambulance, cursing her out between pained gasps. Olivia knelt beside Shadow, pressing her forehead to his. "You saved me again," she whispered. His tail thumped weakly. Days later. Ryan stood in the hospital room doorway, arms crossed. "You look like hell." Olivia smirked. "You should see the other guys." Shadow lay on the bed beside her, head resting in her lap. She ran her fingers through his fur. "Think you'll ever listen when someone tells you to sit this one out?" Lawson asked. Wincing as he shifted in his chair, she grinned. "Not a chance." Monroe entered, tossing a file onto the table. "Feds are taking over," she announced. "This was bigger than we thought." Olivia nodded, unsurprised. Monroe's gaze softened slightly. "You did good, Carter." "You too, Shadow." Shadow lifted his head at the sound of his name. She reached out, scratching behind his ears. "You saved the city, boy." He closed his eyes, content. Olivia exhaled, sinking back into the pillows. For the first time in weeks, she let herself breathe. They had won.